moving through the ridge timber in a slow arc above our fire, and by the third night, the thing making it had a face, and that face was turned toward Aldous Pruitt, and not toward any of the rest of us. I did not go back for him. I have said so under oath 3 times now, and I will say it again here, and it will not change the sound I still hear when I close my eyes. My name is Carver James Mull. I am 34 years of age. I hold a certificate of survey practice issued by the state of West Virginia in the year 1882, and I have been employed in that capacity, primarily by coal interests operating out of Wheeling and Charleston, for the better part of 5 years preceding these events. I am giving this statement at the request of the Mingo County Inquest Commission in the offices of the county sheriff at Williamson on the 14th day of November, 1887, some 6 weeks following the events I am about to describe. I am not under medical supervision at this time, though I was for a period of approximately 9 days following my return. I am telling this in the order it happened, as clearly as I can, and I am asking the recorder to note that I understand the consequences of providing false testimony to an official proceeding, and that I am providing none. The contract came to me through a coal acquisition concern in Wheeling by the name of Caldwell and Associates, who were at that time buying mineral rights across a broad stretch of Mingo County in anticipation of the railroad coming through. They needed boundary lines run on a ridge tract above Pigeon Creek, approximately 3 miles east of the settlement that was then being called Matawan, though it was barely a settlement at that point, more a collection of mill houses and a company store. The tract in question was roughly 400 acres of mixed hardwood and second growth on the upper shoulders of a ridge that locals called, to the extent they called it anything, simply the upper ground. That phrase was as specific as anyone would get. I will return to that matter. I assembled a crew of 3 men, which is standard for this kind of work. My head chainman was a fellow named Thomas Boggs, who had worked with me on 2 previous surveys in Logan County, and who I trusted without reservation. He was 31, a compact and careful man with a particular stillness to him that I had always read as professional composure. He did not panic easily. I have reason to value that memory now. My second chainman was Aldous Pruitt, 22 years old, hired on recommendation from a cousin of mine who had employed him for logging work the previous season. Pruitt was a strong young man, eager to prove himself competent, and he talked more than was sometimes useful on a survey, but I had no complaint with his work. The 4th member of the crew was my instrument carrier and general camp hand, a man of perhaps 45 years named Silas Roan, who had been working survey camps since before I was certified. Rowan was not a skilled technician, but he knew the country, knew how to make a camp hold heat through a West Virginia October, and he was the one who first tried to warn me, which I will address in the proper sequence. We departed Matawan on the morning of October the 3rd, 1887. We had 2 horses carrying the instruments and camp supplies, and we went on foot ourselves up the hollow road that follows Pigeon Creek before turning northeast onto a logging trace that climbed toward the upper ground. The morning was cold and clear, the leaves mostly turned but not yet fallen, and the sound of the creek followed us up the hollow for a good 1.5 miles before the ridge closed around us and it faded. I want to be accurate about sound in this account, because sound is the thread that runs through all of it, and the recorder should note that I am making a deliberate effort to describe what I heard as precisely as I can, because what I heard is in some ways more important than what I saw. The upper ground, when we reached it, was unremarkable to look at. Mature oaks and hickories on the shoulder, mountain laurel thick in the draws and hollows below the ridge, some second-growth chestnut on the steeper faces. The kind of terrain I had worked a dozen times across the southern coalfield counties. There was no obvious reason why the families in the valley below would have left it unworked. The timber was good, the ground not especially broken. I noted the absence of old stump lines, which would have indicated prior logging, and the absence of any trace of a previous survey, which suggested the mineral rights had never been formally assessed. And neither of these things struck me as sinister at the time. I thought the families in the valley were simply conservative, as families in those mountains tended to be about land that had been in contention, and the Hatfield territory was land that had been in contention for as long as anyone could remember. Silas Roan said something to me on the afternoon of the first day, while we were establishing our base camp in a flat area just below the main ridge, sheltered on the north by a rock outcrop and accessible to a good spring about 40 yards down the slope. He came to me while Boggs and Pruitt were driving stakes, and he said it quietly, without preamble, in the way of a man who has made a decision to speak and wants to get it over with. He told me that he had asked about this ground before we left Matewan, asked one of the older men at the company store, a fellow who had been in the hollow since before the war, and that this man had told him only that the upper ground above Pigeon Creek was not worked because it was not supposed to be worked, and that there was a name for the thing that lived up there, but that he would not say the name in a building where people had to sleep afterward. I told Rowan that I appreciated him telling me, and that I would keep it in mind, and that we had a contract and a season's work depending on this survey being completed, and that old men at company stores had reasons for keeping timber uncut that had nothing to do with creatures in the hills. Rowan looked at me for a moment, then nodded once and went back to work. He did not argue. He had done what he considered his duty by telling me, and from that point he seemed to make a private adjustment, a settling of accounts within himself, and he worked the rest of the first day with the same steady competence as always. We had the camp established by late afternoon, a good fire going, the horses picketed on a patch of dry grass below the spring. The first night passed without incident. The woods were quiet, in the way October woods usually are, the insect noise gone, the birds moving through in the last of the migration but not settling. I slept adequately. The horses were still in the morning.
Never do these 3 things after a car accident if you want to potentially receive any money at all. Number 1, never sue the person who hit you. I got $105,000 after my accident, and I never sued the other driver, I never set foot in a courtroom, and I never had to deal with insurance myself. Here's the thing most accident victims don't realize. When you sue the driver who hit you, you could be signing up for years of courtroom stress and depositions while having to pay thousands in upfront legal fees. There are some victims who found a better way to receive the maximum amount they may be owed without stepping foot in court. Which brings me to number 2, never deal with the insurance company directly. I don't care how nice the adjuster sounds on the phone. I don't care how fair their offer seems. Their entire job is to pay you as little as possible. After my accident, insurance came at me with $6,400. My car was wrecked. I was still going to physical therapy twice a week, and $6,400 didn't even cover half of what I'd already lost. But they made it sound reasonable. They always do. I was honestly ready to just sign and move on. Then a friend told me about the Accident Settlement Service. It's a service that could help accident victims get what they may actually be owed without going to court, without paying upfront legal fees, and without dealing with insurance directly. But here's the important part. It's not available to everyone. You have to qualify first, which is also number 3 on the list. Never assume you don't qualify without checking. This is the one that could keep people broke. They look at their accident and think, mine wasn't bad enough, or I was just a passenger, or insurance already made me an offer so it's too late. And they could be walking away from life-changing money because they never took 30 seconds to actually find out.
We began the survey work on the second day. I set up my transit instrument at a known point and shoot a line of bearing, while the chainmen carry the steel chain along that line, marking intervals at every 66 feet with a pin. The pins are brass, about the length of a man's hand, sharpened at one end to push into the ground and ringed at the other for counting. Each chainman carries 11 pins and trades them off as the chain advances. It is repetitive work, physical work, and it requires a particular kind of focused attention because the chain must be held level and straight, and the pins must be set exactly at the 0 mark of each length. Pruitt was good at it. He had a steady eye and a natural feel for holding tension in the chain without overrunning a set pin. I will come to the matter of what Pruitt shot at the laurel thicket, and what we found when we dressed it, because that is the event that I believe set everything in motion. But I want first to note something that Boggs observed on that second morning, something that I recorded in my field notes, and that the sheriff's party retrieved with the instruments when they went up in October. Boggs was clearing a line through second growth along the east face of the ridge, using a hatchet to trim the smaller brush, when he called me over to look at a series of depressions in the soft ground along a seep. They were not tracks in the conventional sense, not a clear print with defined edges, but rather a series of heavy compressions set at a stride interval that he estimated by stepping alongside them at between 5 and 6 feet. That is a walking stride of 5 to 6 feet. He looked at me, and I looked at him, and we did not say anything for a moment. Then I told him to note the location in his chain record, and we moved on. I want to be clear that I was not frightened at that point. I was curious, and I was cautious, and I made a note to tell Rowan and Pruitt to stay in pairs,
Would you be happy if you...
looking in the brush. I attributed the depressions to a large bear, possibly the largest bear that part of the county had produced, moving through the seep in soft ground. A large bear can have a surprising stride when it is moving at speed on all fours, and the ground in that seep was exceptionally soft from the previous week's rain. I told myself this was a reasonable explanation. I still believe it was a reasonable explanation for the tracks. It was not a reasonable explanation for anything that happened after. The shooting happened in the middle of the afternoon of the second day. We were working a line through a draw that cut below the main ridge to the south. A wet draw, with laurel standing 8 and 10 feet high on both sides, and the ground soft and mossy underfoot. Pruitt was carrying the forward end of the chain through the laurel when he stopped suddenly, held up his hand, and then called back that there was a deer in the brush to the left, about 30 yards, standing still enough that he could get a clean shot. He had a rifle, a Winchester repeater of moderate caliber, and we had agreed before leaving Matewan that fresh game taken on the survey was permissible and welcome, because it reduced the supplies we had to carry, and the work was hard enough that the men appreciated a proper meat meal. I gave him leave to shoot. He shot once. We heard the animal go down immediately, no thrashing, a clean kill. Pruitt went in to dress it, and Boggs and I went in behind him with the chain. What we found in the laurel is what I have thought about every day since, and what I have described 3 times now to the commission, and what I will describe again here as plainly as I can, because the nature of the animal is relevant to the nature of what followed. The animal was dead. It was approximately the size of a mature white-tailed doe, and from a distance, looking at the body in the shadow of the laurel, I might have confirmed it as a deer without looking further. But Pruitt had already knelt beside it, and the expression on his face when he looked back at me was not the expression of a man who had made a clean kill and was pleased with himself. It was the expression of a man who had found something wrong and did not yet know the word for what kind of wrong it was. The joints of the animal's legs were reversed, not injured, not broken in the fall, reversed, as though whatever design had made the animal had taken the standard architecture of a deer's limb and run it backward from the knee. The angle of the lower leg was inverted, bending in the direction that a deer's leg does not bend, and the hooves, where they should have been at the end of a standard articulated limb, were positioned to face the wrong direction when the animal stood, which meant the animal, when standing, would have stood on the backward-facing point of a leg that bent toward rather than away from the observer. I am trying to be exact. The anatomy was inverted below the knee on all 4 legs. How the animal moved, what its gait looked like in life, I cannot say with certainty. I can say that the track depressions Boggs had found in the seep that morning were not, I now believe, made by a bear. The teeth were mammalian, but not deer teeth. They were flat-crowned in the manner of a grazing animal, but there were too many of them, crowding the jaw in a way that suggested either a developmental abnormality of a scope I had never encountered, or a dental structure that simply did not correspond to anything I could identify. I am not a naturalist. I have butchered a great many deer. I know what a deer's mouth looks like. This was not that. The proportions of the limbs were wrong in a way that I found difficult to articulate at the time, and find no easier to articulate now. The forelegs were too long relative to the body, longer by what I estimated as 6 to 8 inches, and the neck was shorter than it should have been, so that the head sat low and forward in a way that gave the carcass a hunched, reaching quality even in death. I looked at it for what felt like a very long time. Then I told Pruitt and Boggs that we were going to bury this animal, we were not going to eat it, and we were not going to describe what we had found to Roan. I told them this calmly. Boggs nodded once, his face flat and unreadable. Pruitt looked at me with an expression that I would describe as the beginning of fear, though he kept it controlled. We dug a shallow grave with the camp shovel that Boggs had been carrying for brush clearing, and we put the animal in it, and we covered it, and we walked back to the survey line. I will note for the commission that I regret this decision with a completeness I cannot fully express. Not because burying the animal was wrong in itself, but because what I was actually doing when I gave that order was choosing not to stop. I was choosing to continue the survey, to protect the contract and the wages and my professional standing, and I was using the burial and the silence as the instrument of that choice. If I had packed the camp that afternoon and brought my crew out of those hills, Aldous Pruitt would be alive. I have been over this many times. I will continue. The second night is when the sound started.
I just got paid $62,000 for my car accident, using nothing but this app on my phone.
If you've never heard of free case evals, it's quickly becoming one of the largest legal help platforms in the country for car crash victims. They've built this tool that's already helped over 140,000 people get life-changing settlement checks, all from just answering a few questions. Here's how it works. The app asks 4 simple questions about your accident. Then it compares your case to millions of others. In seconds, it tells you whether you qualify for a big cash payout. I first found out about this from a guy named Raymond about 3 years ago. Raymond got hit hard in a bad crash. He lost his car, was dealing with serious pain, and the insurance company refused to pay him anything fair. So he posted a video that went viral, sharing how he used this exact tool and got a $125,000 payout in just a few months. Then it happened to me. I was stopped at a red light when some distracted driver slammed into the back of my car. I messed up my back, my car was totaled, and worst of all, I lost my job because I had no way to get to work. Luckily, I remembered Raymond's video. I clicked the same link he used, answered the 4 questions, and boom, it said I qualified. Fast forward just 60 days and I had this check in my hands. It helped me replace my income, pay off debt, and get a new ride. Then I shared this tool on my own social media and my friend Jasmine used it. She ended up getting $147,000. I also told my buddy Eli, who had been in a wreck the week before. He was skeptical, but he gave it a shot and got $178,000. What I love most is how beginner friendly it is. You don't need to know anything about the law. Just click the link, answer 4 questions, and in seconds it tells you what you might qualify for. And if your case qualifies, you get connected to a free case eval specialist who handles everything. No fees up front, no court dates, no stress. A few years ago, I had no idea what to do after a car accident. I probably would have just hired some random attorney and hoped for the best. And we all know how that usually goes. But now I know better. And I'm glad I saw Raymond's video when I did. Jasmine is terrible with tech, and even she ended up getting a 6-figure payout. Eli? He was offered just $6,000 by insurance, but ended up walking away with $178,000. That's $172,000 more without ever talking to the insurance company again. So yeah, this is for anyone who's been injured in a car accident. Just click the link below, answer 4 quick questions, and see if your case qualifies for a major settlement. Just like I did. If you qualify, the team at Free Case Evals handles everything for you. You don't pay a dime unless you win. Thousands of people, like me, Raymond, Jasmine, and Eli, have already used this and gotten huge payouts. Imagine that moment when you check your account and see tens of thousands hit it out of nowhere. That's the power of this tool, so don't wait. Click the link, answer 4 questions, and see how much your accident might be worth. And please, share this with your friends and family who've been injured too. They deserve to get paid what they're owed. Free Case Evals. Click the link below and find out what your car accident is worth in 30 seconds or less.
I was driving in the school zone. I was taking my kids to school. I was stopped at a red light.
There was an employee for another company texting and driving. Just blasted into the back of the car with my whole family in it. Everything about the law firm's been phenomenal. Everybody's been punctual, respectful, helpful, extremely accommodating. If you're injured, come to George Singh's law firm. It's worth it.
At George Sink Injury Lawyers, we fight so you don't have to.
We had eaten supper, such as it was without the fresh game we had expected, and the fire was built up well, because the temperature had dropped sharply through the afternoon, and there was a wind coming off the ridge that carried the smell of wet leaves, and something else underneath it, something I did not identify then, and am not certain I can identify now, a faint sharpness, like iron, or like the smell of a struck flint, clean and cold. I have said the dominant record of these events is what I heard, and it begins here. It was perhaps an hour after full dark, maybe 9 o'clock. The wind had settled, and the fire had settled with it into a steady, low burn. Boggs and Roan were in their blankets. Pruitt was sitting up, feeding the fire. I was sitting across from him, reviewing my field notes by the firelight, when the sound came from the timber above us on the ridge. It was a crack, a single, sharp, splintering crack, the sound of a tree failing, not falling, not the long creak and crash of a tree coming down in a storm. The sound of a tree being broken at mid-height, a sudden violent fracture, the kind of sound a trunk makes when something applies enormous lateral force to it very quickly. It was above us on the ridge, perhaps 80 yards north of the camp, and it was immediately followed by silence. Pruitt looked up. I looked up. Boggs stirred in his blankets but did not wake. The sound did not repeat for perhaps 3 minutes. Then it came again, from a slightly different direction, perhaps 20 degrees east of where the first crack had been, at approximately the same distance from camp, still 80 yards or so. Still in the upper timber above the firelight, I told myself, and I told Pruitt when he looked at me with a question in his face. That wind damage sometimes ran in sequence through standing timber, particularly along a ridge exposed to the northwest after a wet autumn. This was factually possible. Trees weakened by fungal damage or saturated roots will go in a line when the right wind hits them, one after another, transferring load to the neighbors as each one breaks. I said this with enough conviction that Pruitt nodded and seemed to accept it, and after a few minutes he lay down and pulled his blankets up. But I sat up a while longer, and I counted the cracks as they came. There were 11 of them that night, each one separated from the last by between 3 and 6 minutes, each one coming from a slightly advanced position around the perimeter of the camp. Not back and forth, not random in direction.
This is the fake ad you see everywhere, right? But this is Ebony, a real game. Now I know what you're thinking, aren't they exactly the same? No, because Ebony is the real number gate runner game. Gotta try it, huh? Nobody ever believes me, but this really is just like the ads in real life.
Great! Woohoo! Oh yeah! Download now.
How do you go from zero experience to flying for one of the world's largest airlines? Let's find out as we go behind the scenes at ATP. Today, I'm here at American Airlines headquarters in Dallas, Texas to learn about the pathway ATP students have to a career at American. How does ATP work with American Airlines to help students become pilots?
ATP pilots and graduates have been advancing to American Airlines for decades. As far as a more formalized partnership, ATP is
Advancing, moving in a clockwise direction around the camp, one crack at a time, each crack incrementally nearer than the last. By the time the 11th crack came, the sound was no more than 50 yards from where I sat, uphill, on the northwest side, and then it stopped and did not resume. I sat without moving for a very long time after that. The horses, picketed below the spring, had gone completely still as well, not the quiet of sleeping animals. The stillness of animals that have chosen, very deliberately, not to make any sound at all. That distinction was not lost on me. I know horses. I know the sounds a horse makes at night in the open, the shift and stamp and the occasional low exhale. There was none of that. There was nothing. I said earlier that I would note the things I had not yet told my crew. I was keeping two things from them at the close of the second night. The first was the full nature of what we had buried in the laurel thicket. Boggs knew, because he had been there, but I had told him to say nothing to Roan or Pruitt, and Boggs was not a man who disobeyed a direct instruction from the man he was contracted under. The second thing I was keeping from the crew was the count of those cracks and the direction of their progression, because I had done the arithmetic in my head while I sat by the dying fire, and the arithmetic was this. At the rate the sound was advancing, tightening its spiral by approximately 5 yards per complete circuit, whatever was making that sound would reach the edge of the firelight in 4 more nights. I did not sleep that night. I want to say something about the quality of those hills in daylight, because the contrast with what happened after dark is important. In the day, working the survey lines, the upper ground above Pigeon Creek was simply terrain. Cold, leaf-fragrant, the light through the hardwood canopy coming down in long yellow bars in the morning and flattening to gray by midday. The survey work was exacting, and it occupied the mind. Boggs and Pruitt called distances down the line with the easy familiarity of men who had done this kind of work long enough to do it without thinking too hard. The chain links chimed faintly when Boggs shook the sag out. The transit legs creaked on the frost when I reset the instrument. The whole enterprise had the texture of the ordinary, and I found myself, in daylight, moving back toward the position that whatever we had buried had been an unusual animal, and whatever was making the sounds at night was a natural explanation running through standing timber in the dark. This is what the day did. The day made it possible to doubt the night, and I used that doubt deliberately, because I had a contract to complete, and men who were depending on their wages, and because I did not, in the daylight, know how to say aloud what I had counted in the dark. On the third day, Rowan said something else to me. He said it while we were eating our noon meal, sitting on a log at the edge of the cleared survey line. He said that when he had gone to the spring that morning before first light to fill the camp kettle, he had heard something standing in the brush uphill of the spring, not moving, stationary. He said it was close, perhaps 30 feet, and that it breathed, but that the breathing had a dry quality to it, a sound he described to me as being like the inside of something that should have been wet but was not. He asked me if I wanted to know what the man at the company store had called the thing that lived in the upper ground. I said yes. Rowan said he would not repeat the name because he thought the name had power, and he did not want to use it up here, where there was nothing between us and whatever owned it. He told me instead what the old man had described as its nature and its habits. He said the old man had told him it was something very old, something that had been in those hills before the first families had come into the valley, and that it could not be killed because it had already passed through the kind of dying that changes what a thing is. He said the old man told him that the thing had a particular grievance with anyone who took from it, that it regarded everything in its territory as belonging to it in the way that only it could understand, and that the old families had left the upper ground unworked, not because they were superstitious about wild places in the general way of mountain people, but because their grandparents had tried to work it once, had tried to cut the timber on the lower face of that ridge, and something had come down out of the upper ground that the workers of that generation had never been willing to describe in detail, but that had ended the operation and put 3 men in the ground without a clear cause for any of them. I sat with this for a moment. Then I asked Roan what he thought we should do.
EVE Online is a vast universe, alive with the unrelenting activity and combined history of its players. Pursuing lives of adventure, warfare, and prosperity, they share this existence in the biggest single shard, free-to-play MMO of all time. Set 21,000 years in the future, EVE takes place in a distant cluster of over 7,000 star systems known as New Eden. It is a rich and diverse universe, featuring densely populated havens of relative safety, governed by 4 great empires. Hostile systems, where player alliances make the rules. Even regions of anomalous and unexplored space that hold their own secrets.
He said he thought we should pack the instruments and leave and not come back, and that he thought we should do it quietly and without hurrying, because he believed whatever was in the timber above us could read urgency, could read panic, the way a predator reads a running thing, and that if we left like men walking away from a finished job, rather than men running from something in the dark, we might be left alone. I told him I needed to think about it. This was the truth. I also told him to say nothing to Boggs or Pruitt until I had made a decision. He agreed to this without comment, and I think he agreed because he understood something about leadership that I was in the process of failing to demonstrate, which is that a leader who says he needs to think about whether to run from danger has already decided not to run from it. I spent the afternoon of the 3rd day completing the south face survey lines. The work went well. The weather held. Pruitt was in good spirits, talking about what he planned to do with his wages when the survey was complete, mentioning a girl in Logan County he was intending to call on. Boggs worked with his usual efficient silence. I took measurements, called bearings, recorded angles in my field book, and I thought about the contract and the wages and the railroad
Yeah. Here's something you gotta understand about I'm gonna say W, okay? They can mimic animals, they can take the form of animals, they can mimic people's voices, they can control the weather around them. One minute you think it's all sunshine, warm, next minute. And the main thing about this is you don't go looking for them at all. Okay, in Native American legends, those W's I'm saying, you do not go looking for them. It's not good to go looking for them. Because when you start looking for them, you open an invitation for them to come find you. My grandpa always say, when it gets winter, don't stay out in cold regions that had a lot of death and disaster happen on it. Virginia, West Virginia mainly had a lot of bad stuff happen there. And they like to show up there. 2. He said when you're in territory like that, respect the land. Don't take nothing for granted. If you're in an area that might have sightings of them, do not remove nothing from the land. Keep it as it is. Because if you take something from their home, they will find you because they are connected to that object wherever you take. If you open a door for them, they will walk in. They can take the form of any person, animal, anything. There was once shamans, or people who did stuff unspeakable to return to one of them. Meaning like eating human flesh. That's very taboo in the American culture. Extremely taboo. in American cultures. You do not eat human flesh. 2. Doing that just to do that is not right. And I don't like speaking about them because they will find you. No matter where you at in the world, if you mention their name, they will find you. 3. They're a lot older than you think they are. These legends about them way beyond Christ. That's all I gotta say. Now let's go back to the video.
Behind Caldwell and Associates, how many more contracts like this one might come to a man with a solid reputation for completing difficult surveys in difficult terrain on schedule? I decided to finish the survey. This is the decision I carry. Not the moment I ran. This one. This is the one that cost Pruitt his life. I want the Commission to understand that I am not attempting to minimize my responsibility by distributing blame across the events. I am trying to specify the precise moment at which my choice created the conditions for what followed, because precision in that regard is what I owe to Aldous Pruitt, who has no one to speak for him now except me. The third night began the same as the second. The fire built up, the crew in their blankets, the temperature dropping hard through clear sky. The first crack came at approximately the same time as it had the previous night, but it came from a different position on the compass, from the southeast rather than the north, as though whatever was making it had continued its circuit through the daylight hours, circling while we worked, and had picked up from where it left off when the dark came back. I counted again. The spiral was tighter. The intervals between cracks were the same, 3 to 5 minutes, but the positions were advancing faster, each crack cutting the angle more sharply than the previous night had done. The circumference of the circuit was smaller. The sound was beginning its night's work from a position already closer to the camp than the previous night had ended. And then something happened that had not happened on the second night. After the fourth crack, which I estimated at no more than 60 yards to the east, there was a pause, longer than any of the previous intervals. Perhaps 15 minutes of silence, and I was sitting up staring into the dark beyond the firelight when the crack came again, and it was close, very close. 40 yards at most, and I could tell from the sharpness of it, the fullness of the sound, the way it had no distance in it at all, that what I was judging as 40 yards might be generous. And between that crack and the next, from somewhere in the dark to my left, one of the horses made a sound. Not a whinny, not the sound a horse makes in alarm, which is sharp and rising and involuntary, something lower and more controlled, a sound from the bottom of its chest, a sound that horses make when they have decided that whatever is standing near them is something they cannot run from, and so have chosen not to run. I have heard that sound once before in my life, in Logan County, when a crew horse was penned next to a caged bear being transported by wagon. It is the sound of a large prey animal making a decision to be very still. Boggs was awake by then. I knew by his breathing. He had the particular controlled stillness of a man lying in his blankets who has decided that moving is not the right choice yet. Pruitt and Roan, I believe, slept through it, or if they did not sleep through it, they had made the same choice as Boggs and were keeping still. I did not wake them. I watched the dark beyond the fire and I listened. The cracking did not resume that night after the close one. There was nothing. The silence had a weight to it, a filling quality, as though whatever had been making the sound had stopped making it because it was now close enough that it no longer needed to mark its position. I got through the night. In the morning, before breakfast, Boggs came to me while I was checking the transit instrument, and he said, without any particular affect, that he wanted me to look at something. He led me to the north side of camp, about 15 yards from where we had laid our bedrolls, and he showed me 2 trees, oaks of about 18 inches diameter, standing perhaps 4 feet apart. Both of them were broken at mid-height, not fallen, still standing in place with the upper portions leaning against their own breaks, splintered ends facing outward from camp, as though whatever had broken them had applied force from the campside, pushing them away. The break heights were approximately 12 feet from the ground. The breaks were fresh, the wood still pale inside the fractures, the fibrous material pulled apart in a way that spoke of tremendous lateral force applied very quickly to a standing timber. There were no marks on the bark below the breaks, no claw marks, no scarring from climbing, no sign of a tool. A 12-foot break in an 18-inch oak requires a force I do not have the physics to calculate, but I know from my years in timbered country that no bear produces it, no windstorm produces it without producing others, and no man produces it without a significant mechanical advantage that would have left traces. There were no traces, just the broken trees and the pale wood, and the smell of fresh sap in the cold morning air. Boggs said, "I think it stood here." I said he was probably right. He said, "What do you want to do, Carver?" I told him I was going to complete the north face lines today, that we were within 2 days of finishing the survey, and that we were going to break camp and descend tomorrow morning at first light, regardless of whether the last quarter section had been fully chained. I told him that I had heard Roane's account of what the man at the store had said, and that I was taking it seriously, and that I thought finishing the work as quickly and quietly as possible and leaving in an orderly manner was the right course. I told him I did not think running was wise, for reasons Roane had outlined, and that I needed him to hold himself together for one more day and one more night. Boggs looked at me for a long time. He is not a man who lets his face tell you much. Then he said, "One day, one night, I'll hold." He held. He was the best man I ever put a chain in the hands of, and I will say so to any inquiry that asks. The problem was Pruitt. Pruitt had heard the cracks on the third night, whether he had admitted to waking or not, and on the morning of the fourth day he was different. Not panicked, not visibly frightened, but different in the way a young man is different when something has gotten into him in the night that he has no category for, and that he is trying to manage through the daylight by not looking at it directly. He worked the chain, he called his distances, but his attention kept going uphill, into the timber on the ridge above the survey line, and twice I had to call his name a second time to get him to reset a pin he had set short. Roane moved through the day with the deliberate economy of a man who has decided he is going to do precisely what is required of him, and nothing more, and who is preserving everything extra for the moment when extra might be the difference between walking and not walking. He made a good camp meal that evening. He banked the fire high. He did these things with the care of a man doing them for what he expected might be the last time. The fourth evening, about an hour before dark, something happened that I have not yet described in previous depositions because I was uncertain how to describe it without the commission thinking I was embellishing. But I have decided that a complete account is better than a careful one, and so I will say it. We were all four in camp, the survey work done for the day, when Pruitt, who was sitting nearest to the east side of the camp, said quietly that there was something at the edge of the timber. I looked where he was looking. The firelight did not reach the trees on the east side, and the sun was already below the ridge to the west, so the timber was in deep shadow, but there was enough ambient light in the sky above it that the tree line was silhouetted against the gray. And in that silhouette, between two oaks that stood perhaps 40 feet from where Pruitt was sitting, there was a shape that was not a tree. I can tell you what it was not. It was not a bear standing upright, though that is what part of my mind attempted to assign to it. A bear standing upright has a particular width at the shoulder, and a particular relationship between the shoulder width and the total height that any person familiar with bears can recognize at distance. This shape had a height that no bear reaches, a height I can only estimate from the relationship to the trees around it, but I put it at something approaching 8 or 9 feet, and the shoulders were not wide in the way a bear's shoulders are wide. They were forward rolled, hunched, as though the thing had been designed for a posture that involved reaching rather than standing, and the arms, where they hung at the sides, were too long, reaching to a point well below where a man's hands would reach in the same posture. The face was toward us. I could not make out the face. The light did not allow it. But the orientation of the head was clear, and what was also clear was where the head was directed. It was not looking at the camp generally. It was not sweeping its attention across all four of us, in the way an animal sometimes surveys a group to find the weakest member, though perhaps that is exactly what it was doing, and the survey was already complete. The head was angled toward Pruitt, specifically toward Pruitt, toward the young man who had pulled the trigger in the laurel thicket 2 days before. Pruitt said, very quietly, "It's looking at me." No one answered him. There was nothing to answer. The shape did not move while we watched it. It stood between those two oaks for perhaps 2 minutes, long enough for every person in that camp to be certain of what they were seeing, long enough for Pruitt's face to go from the controlled unease of the afternoon to something else, something that did not have a controlled component at all. Then the light failed and the silhouette was gone, and I am not certain whether the shape moved away or whether the dark simply swallowed it. Nobody said anything for a long time. Boggs spoke first. He said it quietly, and he said it directly to me, the way a man speaks to his commanding officer when the situation has changed, past the point where the original plan is viable. "We're leaving," he said, "tonight, while we can still move." I looked at him. I looked at Pruitt, who was still facing the tree line with an expression that I had not previously seen on a grown man's face, and that I would classify, looking back, as the expression of someone who has been found. Rowan was already at his bedroll, not packing it, just sitting on it, his hands flat on his knees, waiting to see what I decided. I want to explain my thinking here, even though I know it is not an explanation the Commission will find satisfying, because it is the truth, and this is a sworn proceeding. My first thought was not to disagree with Boggs. My first thought was that he was right, that we needed to leave, and that we needed to leave immediately. My second thought, arriving very quickly behind the first, was the arithmetic of the night before last, the tightening spiral, the advance rate. If the thing in the timber had been circling us for 2 nights already, if it had already committed to a course of action, then leaving in the dark with 2 horses and full instrument packs on terrain we had only traveled once before, on a logging trace that was not clear for night travel, was its own kind of risk. And if the thing could move through that timber at the speed implied by its circling pattern, then the difference between us and it in the dark, on that terrain, was not a difference that favored us. My third thought, and I offer this not in my defense but in the service of complete honesty, was the contract. I told Boggs we would leave at first light. He said, "First light is a long time to wait." I said it was our best option. I said we would build the fire as high as we could manage, keep watches in pairs through the night, have the horses packed and ready before midnight so that we could move the moment we had enough light to see the trace. I said we had gotten through 3 nights already, and 1 more was manageable. Boggs looked at me. He did not agree, and he did not argue. He went to the horse line and began checking the pack riggings, and the quietness with which he did it told me that he had made his own calculation and was putting his own life on the side of my decision without fully believing in it. Rowan started building the fire. Pruitt sat facing east for a long time before he turned around. I want to describe the 4th night in the order it happened, because the order matters. The first crack came earlier. Not at 9 o'clock, not an hour after full dark. It came at dusk, when there was still a thin gray light in the sky to the west, before we had finished eating. It was close, perhaps 55 yards to the northeast, in the oak timber on the upper slope. 1 crack, and then silence. There was no second crack. That was new. Previous nights there had been a progression, a count, a pattern of advances. This night there was 1 sound, and then nothing, and the absence was worse than the pattern. The pattern had been something I could count, something I could locate in space and measure against a known rate of advance. one crack with no follow-up, was a different kind of communication, and the communication it made, if I was reading it correctly, was that the thing making it no longer needed to announce where it was. We ate without speaking. The fire was built to a size that produced real heat and real light, and we had arranged ourselves with our backs to each other, so that no one in the group was facing away from the outer darkness without someone facing toward it. This was Boggs's organization, and I was grateful for it. He had also shifted the horses from the spring picket to a position closer to camp, not because that necessarily protected them, but because having them visible and accessible felt tactically important. The night was dead still. After the single crack at dusk, nothing. No sound from the timber, no branch movement, no sense of anything in the dark at all. And I will tell you that the nothing was more frightening than the sounds had been, because the sounds had told me where it was, and the nothing told me nothing, and by 10 o'clock I was sitting by a fire that I had built as high as I could manage, and I was listening to a silence that had a presence in it, a weight, the way a room has a different quality when someone is standing in the far corner of it, even before you turn to look. Pruitt's watch was the second watch, from midnight to 2, and I will not say now that I should have kept him off it, because the Commission may interpret that as me having prior knowledge of what would happen, and I did not have prior knowledge, only dread, which is not the same thing. He took the watch without complaint, and I lay down in my blankets, and I was not fully asleep, hovering in the half-conscious state of a man too tired